everybody. This is Ben Lee. Welcome back to On the Future of Being a Musician. My interview for this episode is with someone who reached out to me, Eliza Hull, who's a musician, a disability advocate, and a writer from Australia. She heard some of the earlier episodes and was really into them and said if I ever wanted to chat about accessibility in the music industry, that she'd love to be part of that conversation. So she's a disabled musician and a really big advocate in the space. She's consulted with APRA, Music Victoria, ARIAs, and has spoken at Great Escape, South by Southwest, Big Sound, and is just working really hard on trying to get the subject of accessibility and music by people with disabilities to become more of a mainstream conversation. She's written for a Double J and Music Network and stuff, but I was just really happy to get to dive in a little bit and hear what she had to say. So here we go. This is my chat with Eliza Hull. Eliza, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I was so happy to get your email a few weeks ago. Sorry for all the delays and rescheduling. It's, this is a podcast about the chaos of the music business, of which, I am a victim in many ways. But you reached out particularly because you had an interesting perspective on changes that you're working on within the music business that really resonated with me. You were talking about accessibility, and that's something that my dad was really passionate about. He was on Waverley Council, which is like eastern suburbs, like Bondi Beach and stuff. And he was in the generation, the 80s, of like beginning to put ramps around the beach and in movie theaters and hearing loops. And so it's a conversation I sort of grew up with, but I haven't been exposed to much of that conversation being extended into the music business. So I was just really excited to check in with you and hear about how you came to be an activist in this sense.
Yeah, well, I feel like the reason that you might not have heard about accessibility in the music industry is because for too long the barriers have been too big and representation is too low. And I guess for me, I've had my disability since I was 5 years old. And I started falling over at school, and mum and dad didn't know why. So it was lots of hospital appointments and lots of surgery. And throughout school, I was a wheelchair user on and off. And as soon as I hit 17, going on 18, it was like, I'm out of here, because I was growing up in regional Albury-Wodonga. There wasn't much happening there for music. So I moved to Melbourne and pursued a music career, joined a rock band first, and then became an MC doing, rap and freestyle with DJs. And then in 2012, launched my, actually, that's not true, is it? Sorry, I might repeat that. Yeah, I think it was around then. 2012. That's right. Sorry. I launched, my solo career and put out my first record. And so I'm releasing my fifth record. And when I first moved to Melbourne, I just didn't ever think to disclose that I had a disability. And even now, statistically, over, 2/3 of musicians that have a disability won't disclose it to a venue they play at, a festival, a record label, a publisher. So for me, I just spent all of those years not walking in front of people, which was a very, very hard thing to do, because I would just make sure that I was sitting down. If I met somebody at a cafe, if I ever went to visit my publisher, I would buzz a different doorbell at their office and make sure that it wasn't my publisher that answered it, make sure that it was another office, so that I could discreetly pull myself up the stairs, because it's impossible for me to get upstairs if there's no railing. But if there's railing, then it takes a long time and I have to pull myself up. And even my booking agent didn't know that I had a disability. And I guess because opportunities in the music industry are hard to come by, and it was my passion and something that I really wanted to do. I've been singing since I was 5 years old. And I guess I felt like if I disclosed that I had a disability, it would just add another complexity in the mix when the industry is already so complex anyway and hard.
I'm so intrigued by, you're talking about living essentially closeted. At the beginning stages of a music career, it's incredibly intimate with the people that, when you talk about sharing vans and hotel rooms, and surely you weren't able to keep it a secret from fellow musicians.
No, so fellow musicians knew, and they would lift me up onto the stage. Often I'd pull the curtain and get them to, I'd either go on as a piggyback ride, get up onto the stage, or they'd lift me up. But often I would have to sit, downstairs while my bandmates were upstairs, backstage. I'd have to just sit out and not be part of it. But my bandmates were, really supportive of, I guess, my decision not to talk about it, but also wanting to help me get to a place where I felt safe enough to disclose it. And it was actually one of my band members that was like, actually, this is really a chance for you to be yourself. And it was due to Dylan Alcott. He runs a festival called Ability Festival. He's a Paralympian here in Australia and a music lover. And my sister actually reached out to him, on Instagram and said, my sister is a disabled artist and she'd love to play on your festival. And he then reached out and said, I had no idea that you have a disability. He'd heard of my music before. And it was then that my bandmate said, okay, now is your time. Now is your time to actually speak about it.
Wow, that's so fascinating. So did you encounter other musicians that were more visibly disabled during that period? Yeah, I just wondered what that was like for you.
Yeah, I think that, not really. And I don't think that that's because disabled musicians don't exist. And now that I am, stepping out into more of an advocacy role and speaking about disability and accessibility, I have a playlist online that is full of disabled musicians, and we exist, that's for sure. And statistically, disabled people are twice as likely to make art and music. So I think that the issue is that during that time when I was hiding, I think a lot of other people were either hiding or not getting that exposure. And that's because, physically we can't often get into venues, but also we're not being billed on festival spots. We're not being, given the opportunity to play venues, and often they're just too inaccessible. Radio stations, I guess, are now moving towards playing disabled artists on International Day of People with Disability. So that's December 3rd worldwide. Often I'll get an email coming through from radio saying, can you suggest artists that we can play? And I would really love if that was just, fed throughout the year, that it's not just one day, because there are just so many incredible disabled artists out there that just aren't getting that recognition, aren't being represented. And I remember when I was 15 years old and I was sitting around watching Killing Heidi win an ARIA. They were my favourite band at the time, and still great act. And I just remember watching them win the award and go up multiple staircases to reach the award, and just very vividly saying to myself, that's not for me, because I can't get up onto that stage. And so I've been really pushing that award shows like the ARIAs have a ramp up onto the stage, even if a disabled artist is nominated or not, because when you're broadcasting out to a country, you have so many emerging young disabled artists watching that and feeling like that's not an inclusive space for me. That's not a space I'm going to be able to get up onto that stage. And that also feeds into, having an Auslan interpreter for people that are deaf, or having, an image description for people that are blind. If we have those accessibility part of ingrained in the music industry, I know that the barriers will be removed, but also that we'll see more disabled artists come forward and hopefully win an ARIA one day.
The attitudes towards making, say, venues or stages accessible to disabled artists, does it follow through that the venues themselves were not accessible to disabled audience members, or was there sort of a double standard with that?
I think we're definitely seeing, more accessibility being added for audience predominantly, which is also just so incredible. I think that then will ultimately feed into venues being more accessible for disabled artists. It's just that stages are often high up and often don't have ramps. And unfortunately, ramps can be very costly for a venue, especially when we're in a time that, audience numbers aren't as high. Venues are struggling. We're, in a COVID world where venues are often not prioritizing accessibility. And we'll often say to me, why would we get a ramp when we're not seeing any need for it? But the issue is we're not seeing any need for it because it's not available. And so therefore a disabled artist can't play in your venue.
Right. So when you first made that leap into advocacy, how did you find the confidence because I think that's something that a lot of people who in all realms of society, people that when they tackle activism, they feel what makes them entitled to speak up with their voice, how they find that confidence to do it?
It's a good question. Sometimes I don't feel confident. I think that's important to say. Sometimes it still feels really scary. But I think I got burnt, really, if I'm really honest. I think that I know what it feels like to be stared at, to be pointed at, to be laughed at, to not be able to get into a venue, to feel like you have to hide who you are. To be, to walk into a venue and somebody in the venue talked to your partner or your friend instead of you, say, does she need a chair? Instead of just asking me. So I guess I've faced those negative attitudes, and I know what it feels like to face those barriers in an industry that I love and adore. Like music is such, it's been really such a huge part of my life. It's enabled me to make such great friends, to express myself, be creative. It's added so much to my life. And I guess, those two things, seeing how they coexist is what really sparks my passion. And I think it's given me purpose as well, just to see. And I guess also I've seen change start to happen as well. Like, I think it would be really hard if I was just constantly pushing up a giant rock and not seeing it tumble down the hill. I am seeing the changes happen. Organizations and, music events are starting to think about it. We are seeing Auslan interpreters and, ASL, American Sign Language, and British Sign Language on, worldwide stages now. We just still got that bit far to go. And I'm really passionate about seeing what can happen if we, truly ingrain disabled musical artists on radio, on our TV screens, because I know how talented so many musicians with disability are, and I know how big the stigma is. Like, I recently at Big Sound, when I was there to talk about accessibility, I told a record label executive, I was just talking about my music, I was sitting there, and then I said, and I'm disabled. Like, I walk differently and I fall over a lot. And it can sometimes just be that subtle, oh, okay, oh, my God, I'm so sorry. Like, that real, and then move away. Doesn't want to engage anymore. And I think that's what I want to change. I want to change the way that, because people have these misconceptions about being disabled and even being a deaf musician. There's an incredible deaf artist in England. He's got, he sounds kind of like the Beatles, actually, in my opinion. He's just got such a beautiful voice. And he's such a great songwriter, and he says because he's deaf, there's just this stigma and misconception that how could he be an artist that is deaf? How can he make music if he's deaf? So I think that, these are the misconceptions and stereotypes that I'm really passionate about shifting.
So in terms of creating a more accessible experience for musicians and for the audience, are these changes that get made through voluntary cooperation of venues and promoters and people throwing festivals, or is it policy that actually needs to be developed? And what's the path for those changes?
Yeah, that's such a tricky question, because I feel like quotas, I guess, can feel kind of tokenistic, can't they? But in a way, my opinion is that we need to implement some sort of quota or policy in regards to disabled people. There's a charter that exists in the UK through Attitude is Everything, and it actually gives venues like a star rating if you are accessible. And venues are kind of fighting for this star that they really want their venue to be accessible for artists and audience. And I think Australia needs to follow, definitely, and other countries need to follow to really implement that idea that we really need to make change here, so that audience can appreciate music and artists can get up onto the stage, artists can be part of the music industry. I'd also just really like to see a lot of, major events will often get an award for a disabled artist. And hopefully one day we don't need that award. Hopefully disabled artists, like other minorities, are just ingrained in society and ingrained in our music industry. That's my hope.
Are there countries or are there examples around the world that you've seen that you'd like Australia to follow suit with?
I think America right now, there's an artist called Louchy. She's a blind musician. She started a coalition called RAMPD, which is spelled RAMPD. It is a worldwide coalition that brings musicians that are disabled from all around the world together, who are, either just making incredible music or making music and advocates as well. And basically it's like a hub that brings people together and shares opportunities. They're also, Louchy is working with another artist called Galen Lee, who's another American artist. She's a wheelchair user and short-statured, and they're just on fire right now. So they have advocated for the Grammys to have a ramp up onto the stage.
Amazing. Have they got that? Yeah. Have they got that?
And, yeah, they've got that.
They've done that.
They've done it.
Okay, amazing.
They've done it,
cool.
Yeah. They had interpreters on the red carpet, interpreters on stage as well, speaking ASL, so American Sign Language. Unfortunately, the American Sign Language wasn't broadcast out on TV.
Oh, really? Huh.
No, it was only shown to the audience that was in the room. So that's another step that they're wanting to implement. They had someone doing live captioning as well, and someone doing audio description for people that are blind. But I think Louchy is wanting, and Galen Lee are wanting for the presenters to come out on the stage and do just a quick image description of who they are, so that if you are somebody that's blind watching the broadcast, you get a sense of who's on stage. They're also, making sure that Netflix, MTV are getting that representation of disabled artists as well, mainly American disabled artists. And I'm just seeing so major support by all of those big companies over there.
But it seems like this could have the ability to much like streaming transparencies, it's something that could be quite unifying in the sense it doesn't need to be an overtly political conversation.
No, I think you're right. I think it's, and I think that who would really want to put a stop to that?
Just the only argument is some people don't want to do anything that costs any more money. And I'm not saying I agree with it, but you hear that a lot within all types of business, where unless they're forced to do something, they don't want to. They don't want to pay extra to do anything for a small customer group. So
Yeah, I think also people maybe are afraid of getting it wrong as well.
Right.
Like, how do I do it the right way? How do I speak about disability? Even using the word disabled or disability can be
I
contentious
know. I
and
was
something
thinking
that
about
people,
that when I didn't know if that was the most. Is that the most up to date, or is there a potpourri of ways people refer to themselves?
well, like a lot of people use euphemisms like differently abled or, even able, and trying to shine a light on the fact that we have abilities as disabled people. But a lot of, I think, most people feel really comfortable now with the word disability and disabled. And, in the 80s, I remember growing up and, like looking back at that time, realizing that I would have been growing up in the 80s and 90s when it was, there were a lot of disability slurs that were used, special, handicapped, a lot of worse words used to describe disabled people. And that is why disabled people were fighting for people first language. So, to remind people that we are people with disability. And now I think we are shifting into a time where to say you're disabled is a statement of speaking about the social model of disability, which is that the world is disabling, that the fact that I can't get into a venue, the fact that I can't get up the stairs that you've got into your venue, it's not my problem. It's actually the world's, the built world that has been created. And if there was just an entry level into your venue, that I would be less disabled by that environment. And so it's talking about the ways that we need to change the world, not the ways that we need to change me. And I think that was like a real moment for me, because I was like, I'd always felt like I wanted to be fixed. I always felt like I needed to be fixed to fit in. And when I realized that if we remove the barriers and that if the world is actually disabling, it made me realize that it's not, I don't need to be fixed. I've had my disability since I was 5, and it's who I am. It's part of me. It's really been, it's really what I do now. It's what I speak about. It's who I am. So it was like a real kind of moment of like, I don't need to change. The world needs to change. And it was a big aha for me, definitely.
I imagine you, in your role as an advocate, have now gotten to meet lots of younger disabled musicians. As the conversation becomes more mainstream, you must see them growing up in a very different world than the one you grew up in.
So, yeah. How exciting is it? Like, it's just so good. And there's incredible artists, deaf and disabled artists here in Australia and worldwide that I'm seeing are getting that representation that really has just been so overdue. As I said, we've still got such a long way to go, but what a great time to live in, where you feel like you can really start to be yourself and share your music and not feel like you have to hide. And some of those barriers are starting to be removed. I think it's a really beautiful time.
That's amazing. So you seem very optimistic about I
actually am.
this to happen. Yeah.
Well, I do believe that I wouldn't have felt like I could have spoken about my disability if the world hadn't started to change. If I had been just living in that world that I was living in, back in, 2000s onwards, I would have wanted to keep hiding because there just wasn't any representation. It was very, very stigmatized to be disabled. And when I started to feel like we were having those conversations, and thank goodness for the disabled people before me that have spoken up about these things, because without them, I wouldn't have felt like it was, I guess, safe enough. Safe is quite a big word, but it is true. Safe enough to disclose who I was and to then speak about the things that I want to see shift and change so that emerging disabled artists can come forward.
And are there resources, if you're a young disabled musician, are there resources or ways to connect with community and get support?
Yeah, absolutely. Here in Australia, we've got an incredible online group called the Australian Disability arts and music group. That's mainly on social media channels. I guess, for me, I just feel like if you can feel like you can disclose, being disabled, I think that it's now is a time to do it, because we really want to hear your music and we really want to hear your story. And I think it's a time that you will feel like you can be more included in the music industry. Other organisations that are doing really well is here in Australia is APRA. They're starting to make real changes. They're making a disability-led songwriting component that are going to travel around Australia and represent disabled artists. And then also Attitude is Everything is an incredible organisation in the UK. It's one of the biggest that supports disabled artists. And as I was speaking about before, RAMPD, which is, spelled RAMPD, that's online, and you can become a member of that organisation.
Amazing. And where can people find you if they want to just follow what you're doing and hear your music and, connect with you?
ElizaHull.com is my website. I'm also on, the social media channels under Eliza Hull as well.
Cool. Thank you so much. And thank you for just enlightening me a little bit about this important issue.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.